another minute or two before we start, but thank you for coming out, and I apologize for the short notice on this one, and most of our presentations this fall has been a bit of a struggle coordinating speakers and agendas. We're trying to sometimes hit a few birds with one stone. We're trying to get a couple of speakers in that are the invitation of the Calum Plan Implementation Committee as well. And that'll be our next speaker 2 weeks from now. Len Vanderstar will be coming out on Wednesday, November 21st to talk about grizzlies of the Babine. And we also have one of our own professors, Carla Glenn, speaking on Wednesday, December 5th about the power of documentary films. So we don't have a general list or agenda of talks for you. We've sort of been playing it week by week, but we now at least have 4 weeks planned out in advance. So today we're honored to have Mr. Dave Jephson here from the fire department. He's the deputy chief there. Dave tells me he's born and bred Terracite, so hasn't been here all his life though. He's traveled around to work in places like Alberta and New Zealand, doing everything from gold dredging to mountain rescue and truck driving, but he's been back in the Northwest since '91, he tells me, actively involved in search and rescue and in firefighting, and the topic of today's presentation, safety preparedness. So I have to give you a little bit of background on this. This is a favorite topic of mine because I teach a course in disturbance ecology. So I'm always talking about death and mayhem when it comes to forests. The flip side is the other professor in geography who talks about natural hazards, and that really has the human element a little more. And then we hand it over to the professionals to tell us how to actually deal with these issues rather than just talk about them and measure them. So, Dave.
Sure. Thank you. It's quite funny that you say death and mayhem, because I probably use that in almost every discussion at every meeting we have, and my kids tell me, Dad, stop talking. Stop telling people are going to die. Thank you very much for having me. We started talking about this, a little while ago. Of course, I procrastinate and I'm busy. So trying to figure out, how we could best cover the topic of emergency management and emergency plans for the city of Terrace. So, I'm a little bit lower on the totem pole. So when I started talking with the chief about it, he volunteered me. So I talk quite regularly, so I have no issues, and it's a good topic to discuss. We're going to talk a few things today. Definitely cover off emergency management. What does that mean? Disasters. What does that mean? And how it kind of fits in with Terrace, the Terrace Fire Department, our partners, whether it be the RCMP, BC Ambulance, Search and Rescue. So we'll kind of talk about all those different things. When we start looking at disasters, disaster means something different to everybody. Somebody's house burns down, that's a disaster. To the fire department, a disaster is a good call. They go out at 3 o'clock in the morning, they work all night long, they sweat, they save people, they recover people, they put stuff out, they come home, they go home and it's like, man, that was a great call. So disaster means something totally different. High water for an agency and people responding is just high water. Water is going to go back down in a week. But to that person whose house flooded, that disaster is now something totally different. So we've learned to try not to just recognize death and mayhem as it is, but also to try to have some compassion and some understanding. So, when we're with those people, how can we help mitigate the problem, and how can we help them get to, the next step of recovery. So that's a big component as part of the emergency management. We have a whole bunch of slides that I've gone through and kind of put together. I use the slides more as a prompt, so not necessarily for you to read word for word. So it's just for us to create the conversation and the topic about different issues to help move us forward. So feel free, if there's a question that you think is really relevant or it affects you, don't hesitate, please answer, and then we'll definitely do more questions at the end as well. So when we start looking at emergency management, Phil was doing some homework. He had gone to the City of Terrace page. The City of Terrace obviously has a fire chief, deputy chief, and a bunch of members underneath of that. The fire chief also fills the role as emergency coordinator for the city of Terrace. So every municipality must have an emergency coordinator. Our current chief, John Klee, is the emergency coordinator. So he looks after a lot of the stuff for the city and how that fits into all the other agencies, such as ESS, to a degree search and rescue, and all the different agencies. So this is an example of a page that's on our city webpage. It talks about the different disasters that we have in our community or our area, and we're going to talk a bunch about those today. The actual number of disasters recorded, it's actually considered there is 72 types of disasters recognized in the world. Everything goes to those numbers and relays to those numbers. Obviously, starting off the conversation earlier, how many, what's a disaster mean to you? Well, Terrace isn't going to have 72 disasters. When we do a hazard assessment or hazardous risk vulnerability assessment in our community, we look at that and we say, okay, what's potential for here? Yes, we have an active volcano near us. Yes, we have earthquakes. Yes, we have snowstorms. Are we going to have landslides? Possibly. Are we going to have a tsunami? Are we going to have a tornado? No. So hurricanes. So there's different things. So you go through your community and you start picking out what you may have. Here's an example. It was a busy year in 07. We had floods. We had large landslides. We had landslides on the highway. We had landslides up on Johnson Hill. We had fires in different parts of our community. We had, of course, lots of flooding. We'll talk about the flooding and the impact that has for us as community members, but also as emergency responders. So this is a good page. We talk about, you'll hear everything emergency planning, emergency management, prepare for 72 hours. I made a presentation for somebody at at the arena during Emergency Preparedness Week, and I told everybody in the room, prepare for 72 hours, but that doesn't mean we're coming to your house in 72 hours. If we have an earthquake and you live on the bench, we may not get there for a week, right? So it starts to, unless there's a major, there's a means for you to communicate with emergency services of people trapped, dire emergency, we're going to be busy somewhere else. If there's an earthquake and we have all the buildings downtown, we may not even get to the outskirts of town, with the resources that we have. So really we say, 72 hours and beyond, you should be able to have everything to sustain your household for 72 hours. That's kind of what we look at. And then if you go to Emergency Management BC, the City of Terrace page, ESS page, you'll start to see exactly what you should have in those kits. And it's water, it's canned food, propane stoves. We have lots of means to look after ourselves. I'm pretty sure that every one of our houses have so much food in it, whether it's the cupboards or the food that we've just never got to in the back closet, or, all that stuff that pertains to the 72 hours. That could help you. But in the event of some sort of a disaster, whether a fire or whether an earthquake, snowstorm, where is that stuff? In an earthquake, if it's in your house and the house has had some damage, are you going to be able to get it? So we do say in a room, in cases, or in boxes, possibly in a garage where it is easy access for you. So there's lots of information out there to help you with that. Know the risks, know the plan, prepare your home, have your kit, make sure everybody in the house knows that. And then emergency services, they're going to try to deal with the rest of it. And emergency management to us means how do we mitigate the problem and how do we mitigate the situation ongoing. So for example, lots of people in Terrace work in Thornhill, vice versa. Earthquake happens in the middle of the day. The school board, for example, they are not allowed to send any students home until a parent comes and gets that student. So if that parent is working out in Thornhill and that school, student is at Uplands, that student stays at Uplands for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days until relieved by that parent or the principal. So some of the teachers don't know that they have to stay there for days, right? So we really try to work with them. What plans or emergency services are in place for the teachers and the school board? So that's a lot of our emergency planning. How do we get a boat to get across the river to start ferrying family members? How do we utilize the helicopters, and how do we utilize resources? And what agencies do we use? So part of the Emergency Act you'll see this is updated October 30th, 2018. It's a local authority emergency management regulation. All municipalities must have one. All municipalities must follow this. Inside the Act, it says that we have authority to declare emergencies, to write orders, to coordinate resources, but it also says that we have to have a plan, that we have to have some sort of idea on how we're going to mitigate it, and also how are we going to help the community recover. So that's another big part. It's not just, for, even today, we have a house fire, we go put the house fire out, we make sure it's not going to, go anywhere else, we pack up the hose, we drive the truck, we can go back to the fire hall. That disaster is over for us. We may never go back to that home. But in a larger community disaster, it's the city's responsibility under the Act and under the law that we actually must mitigate that for our citizens in our community, which we follow. So we follow this Act. There's good links. I talked earlier about our disasters. Here's a kind of a rough list on different disasters. Of course, we have air crashes, accidents up top. I would definitely put some rail up in there. We have a lot of rail coming through here. We're going to have way more rail coming through here once all the ports and the activities start going. A lot of propane cars. So that causes us, as part of our emergency plan, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with the rail yard cutting off access to north side of the tracks, south side of the tracks? Blizzards, snowstorms, different epidemics, different explosions, different types of avalanches. We have avalanches regularly around us. Of course, anybody knows the road to Prince Rupert has been, was closed the other day and is still single lane. Different, hazards. This, again, we could throw in our hazmat stuff in here for our rail transport, power outages, riots. It's been a while since we've had a good public disorder going on. I think I think Halloween quite a few years ago was probably the last one, but structural terrorism, volcanoes. So interesting article. Is it north of Whistler? There was a big article from some geologist saying that that's going to be our next volcano going off. The signs are there, as far as stuff, the melting, the mountain doing different things. So it was a great read on that. So when we start looking, where do we get our information from? Who do we work with? What rules do we have to follow? So we follow. The other agency that's out there is called Emergency Management BC. That's the governing body that, kind of sets out some direction. It would be considered the government, and then we would fall under that. And in the event of a disaster happening in Terrace, outside of Terrace, some sort of local authority or search manager, emergency coordinator would contact EMBC, and they would get a task number. That task number now covers us to go and respond and get some basic coverage. In some cases, so for example, search and rescue, when they get a task number, their expenses are covered for that event that they're active in. The city of Terrace, that they don't get a lot of expenses back, but they start getting liability, or it opens the door to more resources. So that's the idea of the Emergency BC. So in this case here, BSERMS, or BSERMS, British Columbia Emergency Management System, this is now a format that outlays everything for us, and it covers all types of disasters. And this is again on AMBC's page. It's an awesome site to look at stuff. How big is the event going to be? Is the city, is the province going to come into it at a pre-oc? So I'll mention that. So when the government opens up an emergency center, it is called a pre-oc, provincial emergency center. When the city opens one up, we open up an EOC, Emergency Operations Center. So all of our management goes into that room, and we start working under the ICS, Incident Command System, and we start to designate tasks on how do we mitigate that problem. So that's an easy way for us to deal with large-scale incidents, and the government does the exact same in the pre-oc. Wildfires. Even though Terrace wasn't physically involved with fires this summer directly, we were still impacted. So EMBC opened up their pre-oc in the northwest here because they were dealing with a lot of broader issues that were affected by the fires. So it's the government's way of coming out and helping and setting stuff up for us. So there's different information you can get on there, different types of disasters, preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. So I kind of talked a little bit about this. This is emergency management cycle, different issues. You know, so when we get into dealing with houses, for us it's straightforward. You know, we go down the street, there's 10 houses destroyed. You know, we don't look at the house destroyed. We go in and look after life safety. You know, is the gas out? How do we prevent further injuries? And then when they go back, then now all of a sudden the city's going to come in, okay, well, what do those 10 houses mean? What does that disaster mean? What infrastructure is affected in this disaster? So a lot of what we're going to talk about and get into now is really the infrastructure to the city and our community and how we work through that. But here's a good information. You know, this is a great brochure that's on the UNBC site, and that helps walk through emergency management. When we start talking fires, of course, that was a general conversation how we kind of led into this talk. Yeah, we're going strong. You know, everybody's blaming climate, everybody's blaming forestry, everybody's blaming the beetle. At the end of the day, what matters the most is we're having lots of fires, and how do we prepare for it? How do we make sure our crews are ready? How do we make sure our communities are ready? How do we make sure our warning systems? When we look at this building here and a fire department member comes and does an inspection, this is a contained building, 4 walls, it's not touching anything else. If it burns down, burns down, they're going to build another one. What do we do to help protect the people that are in here? We have a fire alarm system. It makes everybody aware that there's an alarm so they could evacuate. We make sure that the doors and the exits are there and it's safe and easy for them to leave. And then third, how do we prevent that fire spread? So we have doors that close. If we look at a larger disaster, when we start talking interface fires, so here's our fires obviously of a few years ago. We now have to, how do we alert our citizens that there's a fire? How do we safely come up with evacuation routes to get everybody in that location to another location? How do we prevent that fire from spreading? And then, remember, going back to the Act, we're also responsible for recovery and looking after. How do we look after 500 people? How do we look after 1,000 people? You know, with the fires that were going in Telegraph this summer, we had a house fire down on Graham Street, Mills. You know, through our ESS program, we were going to find a location for the lady or the homeowner to stay that night. There wasn't a hotel open. That person was going to have to go to Prince Rupert because all the rooms were full from fire evacuees. So the next thing for us, I'm going to show you some pictures. Where are they going to sleep? They're going to sleep on the floor in a gym. You know, so when we start talking disasters, you know, you try to hug a little bit, but during a disaster, you know, we don't get to hug. We're coming in, we're moving you out, and we're taking you to a community hall, and you get to stay in that community hall. And some people aren't going to like it, but what else is there? You know, we've looked at, you know, obviously Canadians are pretty awesome. You know, we look at St. John's, look at 9/11, right? How many planes landed and how many communities opened their doors and homes? People were, you know, they had 15 people living in one house. So in a larger disaster, I know people in Terrace would do the exact same thing. But again, in the meantime, where do we put those people? So that's part of our planning, right? Through our ESS group, they're awesome group. They do a lot of pre-planning. They've pre-planned all the schools, the churches, large halls. Can we move into this church? Can we move into this school? And how many beds would fit in here? So in this, for example, if we came and took over this building in this location, this could be a designated room for X amount of beds. You know, we're trying to get better at ESS. I know I say we're not supposed to hug all the time, but once in a while you are supposed to hug. So if some people can't go into a large room, can we find another space for them? If a family is together, you know, with children, can those children be in a large room? So we're getting much better at emergencies and disasters to try to treat everybody, you know, as best we can to help mitigate the problem. And that would be an example, large hall, small room. So our ESS does that. That's in the event of a fire. which we've been having. And when fire decides to roll through the communities, there's no stopping it. We've been witnessing that over the last few years, whether it be Slave Lake, whether it be Kelowna. Of course, Fort McMurray was huge. Telegraph obviously suffered a lot of losses, as well. On a fire season for buildings lost, it was a very low season for buildings lost, high in forest and high impact. And losing those forests, that's tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of income for the economy. So it affects us. It may not affect a homeowner, but it does affect us as workers and the community. How do we prepare for that? Our firefighters, all firefighters, not just Terrace firefighters, we prepare by going to school. A lot of our education and our schooling never stops. Even though you've been on the job for 25, 26, 30 years, you're still taking courses. You're still taking certificates. You're still doing things to enhance your skill so you can deal with different problems. Our firefighters are trained to look after a house fire. Our captains are trained to look after our big apartment fires. Our chief officers are looking after, disasters and larger community stuff. And then, it just continues to ramp up the training. So this, for example, is the S215. This is different trainings when it starts dealing with forest fires and structural fires. When we start talking with forest fires, your firefighters here in your community, they see a burning building, they race to the building, they put on a pack, and then they run into the fire or the building with fire all around them to try to mitigate the problem. Forest fires, they set the fires and they contain the fires to try to limit where they burn, right? So that's how they manage it. They can't run. If a forestry firefighter runs into that fire, they're going to perish, right? That's how violent that fire is. So what they do in their training is they look at the fire, they know where it's been going, they're super educated, they're planning, they know the fire is working this way. If they do this tactic, it's going to contain it. When it gets out of control, we see Slave Lake burning. When it gets out of control, we see Kelowna, we see Fort McMurray. So those are issues we do the best we can to deal with those problems, but sometimes it does get very large. So here's an example of some training that how do we deal with the broader spectrum of just firefighting, and here's kind of an example of that. So different training, different requires. This is out of the same handbook. Obviously we're worried about fire coming into our community. How's that going to affect? So imagine all of these homes, these homes now become the forest because it just goes from one house to the next house and it continues to keep on burning. So how do we work with our agencies? How do we work with forestry to mitigate those problems and prevent that fire spread? So we talk lots about that. How do we attack those fires? Obviously for us, our turnout gear is not made for us to go climb up Terrace Mountain. It's made to go inside of that burning building. So we have to think differently. We have to plan different. And when we are faced with that, we have different struggles. So we try to work directly with forestry and their crews. Even though we had a fire, if we had a fire in a large forested area, we would be phoning forestry as well. It's not their jurisdiction, but we know that they're there to come and work with us. Same as Terrace Mountain. So we start to have, and how does it affect us? Where do people want to live nowadays? Some people want to live in the concrete apartment, and they love that lifestyle. Others want to live on a smaller on the outskirts. Others want to live on a farm. Others want to live on a mountain. You have a responsibility if you live in all of those areas. How do you become fire smart? How do you prevent? How do you look after stuff so you can help mitigate the problem as well? And ultimately, you have to realize if you live in a forested area and you're surrounded by forest, a good chance your house is going to burn down. How can you prevent stuff from happening? Through forestry, and if you learn fire smart, there's a lot of stuff at the fire department that we hand out for that. Simple as cleaning your eaves troughs. So the embers on a forest fire will blow 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers down the road and land. And so if you have if you have an ember on fire the size of an orange or an apple landing on your roof, and it rolls down into your eaves trough, and there's needles and dry moss, what's happening to that eaves troughs? It's starting on fire, it's now getting onto the plywood, and that's how they lose most of the homes. They're getting very, very proficient now. A lot of the structural firefighters that are called in to go and help with forest fires nowadays are going to set up sprinkler protection. So we're doing everything we can to try to save houses. But, ultimately, when we get urban firefighters going into large communities that are on fire, they drive down the street and they say, okay, the fire is already into the roof, they go past it. Okay, it's on the outside of the house, yes, we can prevent that. Okay, goes to the next place, and they unfortunately have to pick and choose. And it's a very, very hard situation for them to do because they know people's lives and belongings are getting burnt down. But they can't save anything. And once this gets going like that, it just goes from house to house to house. What can be done? What can you do? So we start making decisions on what we could knock over. Has the community had fire smart? What's the number one? Where do we put all of our wood? For our wood stoves, we put it underneath our sun deck. Well, you just put 5 logging trucks of trees underneath your sun deck. What's going to go first? Your sun deck. So your house, in a case like this, triaging, your house is not going to be saved. And I'm guilty. I have vinyl siding on the side of my house, and it's just gasoline, so I'm susceptible to that. I have a hedge all the way around, and I have the hedge touching my house. I'm susceptible to that. So we all live in that. It's a bit of a balance, but those are things that you can try to do to help mitigate. Emergency services, they do the best they can to try to save as much as they can, but ultimately we can't. We look at it from emergency management point of view. When the fire starts and the fire starts to burn through the community, how could we get everybody in that area away? How can we get them living safely somewhere else? And then how can we mitigate the problem to help get them back in as best we can? We know we're going to lose homes. Ultimately, we don't want to lose lives. Some concerns that we have at the fire department, this is a big area I keep on hammering. This is this is McConnell College is over here. Thomas, this is Upland School. This is Halliwell here. Any fire in here, and we've had 5 summers now that have just been right on the verge. 5 summers ago, we're going to talk about some pre-plans that we made for Terrace Mountain. When forestry comes to you and says we've never seen the conditions like this before, we're really, really, really worried. What do we do? And it's like, holy cow, man, what do we do, right? So we try to start preparing. So that's when we make evacuations. That's when we start having plans. This last year, we started talking again. We had started to have meetings at the city level. Okay, how are we prepared for this? Are we prepared for EOC to set up? Are we prepared for evacuations? What happens if a fire starts here or here? So we're always thinking about it 24 hours a day, unfortunately. How do we mitigate it if it happens? So here's an area that we just a month ago we met with forestry. What happens if the fire comes from the north and blows down? What happens if it starts in town here and gets into these? And how do we evacuate these people quickly? How do we notify them? How do we get them somewhere? And again, just more pictures of fire spreading. If you're a fire truck, or you're on a truck, going down this street, you're not even going to spray water at any one of these houses. We hope that they've been evacuated, they've been moved to other locations, and emergency services are going straight past there. We can't do anything with these. Today, if we had this house fire right now over on Benner Street or Scott Street, you're going to have 15 people running into all those houses, spraying a ton of water, doing the best we can. Because we know what? The fire is contained to that. But if the forest fire has lit this and it's coming, there's fire behind us, around us, and it's a bit of a balancing act. Structure, so different actions. So structure protection, site preparation. So a lot of forestry now, they are so good at it now. Truly, they are the ones that are responsible for preventing such losses over the last few years. Is they'll go into an area, they'll backburn a lot of this, they'll set up sprinkler units, and they'll start protecting different crops, different houses everywhere. They do a phenomenal job with that. They call for resources throughout the province. Fire departments from all over BC go, and their role is to set up structure protection, right, at the direction of the forestry professionals. Same thing. If you're living in this house here, yes, it's a good view. Just make sure you have, possibly life insurance, but definitely house insurance, right? Because it's coming. Now, if you don't want to use your life insurance policy, you know, what else can you do? Pay attention. Be aware. Don't wait for the fireman or the policeman or the search and rescue member to come and knock on your door. If you have a fire in your area, it's your responsibility as well to be prepared. If there's a fire in Kitimat, in the Kitimat Valley, I'm going to be on the radio with the city saying people need to be aware that there's a fire in the community. I've already told you, embers blow 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers down the road. So if that wind changes and it starts rolling our way, you don't want to be, oh, well, they never gave me notice. You had notice, right? So we're going to start ramping up. And you're seeing more and more of UNBC evacuate sooner, right? So some of those are precautionary, you know, moves, but we can't afford to have a community burn with citizens still in it. Fort McMurray was way, way too close, right? And that's why you're starting to see more people be evacuated sooner. Not all people like that. There's different areas, different groups that are saying, well, you didn't follow the right process to evacuate. We're not actually coming and asking if you would like to evacuate. We're showing up and we're escorting you out and you have no choice, period. And if some people don't like that, they'll get over it, right? Because death is imminent, and I think that there's been a few mayors and a few emergency services, they'll stand up in front of everybody, the officer, the inspector, and they'll just say, if you decide to stay, please give us a sample of your DNA before we leave the house. That's how sure they are that it's going to turn bad. So, you know, we do the best we can. So here's some examples on that. In Terrace, simply, this is just different systems. We've tried to come up with different techniques. You don't have to fight a forest fire or grass fire like we do our structures. So we've come up with these different, this is a forestry manifold, 1-inch econo lines. You know, how do we pull the hoses off the truck quickly? How do we spread it out? How do we protect it? In this case here, you know, unattended, that fence is going to go up right away. You know, we had a fire this summer. It was just right on the edge, holy cow, at Twin River Estates. You know, that fire was getting into the attic seconds away. It was getting into that beautiful hedge that they have on the east side of the property seconds away. And what's at the end of the hedge? The side of Terrace Mountain. That's dry. So that hedge, if it would have got into that hedge, it would have gone down there in seconds, minutes, and it would have been up the side of the building. So, you know, it's very important that we hit it quickly, and there's different techniques here. So that's one disaster. We know we're going to have one disaster, you know, definitely as fires, we have that. We're surrounded by forests. Our communities are growing. So we know that that's one. The other disaster that we definitely have is floods. We saw some pictures early, 2007. So one of the situations, the city of Terrace obviously has to prepare for floods. We are affected by floods, especially when we start looking at our south side, southwest Terrace. We have infrastructure that's affected by floods. And many times, you know, so the fire department will play a role to assist police or the RCMP and also warn citizens, set up the emergency management, set up emergency operations center. But in cases like this, when floods start happening, one of the partners to the fire department emergency services is, of course, search and rescue. So we have a very active group in search and rescue in Terrace, give or take 65 members. They cover all disciplines, you know, between dive rescue, swift water, tracking, avalanche, you know, tons of different groups, you know, whether it be searching, whether it be recovery, Terrace Mountain. They're also a resource to the city for larger evacuations or larger pre-planning. So in the event of a mass evacuation, the emergency coordinator would be calling a search manager and saying, we need as many people as we can. We need to evacuate, you know, how many people can you get? And search and rescue members would show up in their coveralls or their high-vis vests, their radios, and they would get their task, and they would go and work with the RCMP, and they would go work with the fire department. When it comes to the floods, the role of the RCMP or the role of search and rescue is going to be get into all of these areas that nobody else can get into. Unfortunately, we'll swim sometimes or we'll use boats. As soon as we start getting into this water, Bronze Island, as soon as you have all the sewage, all the farms, all that stuff comes on to us. So we have to have good decon we use the fire department. So we'll respond, we'll evacuate homeowners, and then we'll go through a proper decon because it is a hazardous environment for us. So search and rescue is a resource. Part of that resource, that in the event something happens in Terrace, so this picture here is the floods that happened down in the Kitimat River last year, September 11th. Terrace search and rescue members were involved with this. They got a call about 2 in the morning. They responded, 5 of them, and they evacuated 13 people from harm's way. This trailer here was when we finally were made aware of these occupants after we saved multiple occupants in different units. This was up here floating down the river with 2 people still inside. So it shows you the force of the water, and that, I think we took a picture after the fact, and I think it was at 6 o'clock. So pitch black, miraculous, you know, it was awesome. You know, they were able to get out there in a boat, pitch black, get onto the back side of this and save the 2 occupants. So my chief told me I had to, you know, it's plug search and rescue. So, you know, and in this, because of this situation and those members have been put forward for Medal of Bravery awards with the government in Ottawa. The 5 of them are going forward for that, as well as a medal being presented or nominated for the Carnegie Hall Hero Memorial as well. So that's another of your awesome community services that you have in your community. So you had a question. I think you had a hand up. No? Sorry. No. Yeah. No. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, so we have to plan for that. So this is obviously the group that went out there at 2 a.m. They made it home safe. It was good. So that's part of our planning. So that's an awesome group, as well as the fire department. How do we move forward? How do we move forward in emergency management? How do we move forward in planning? So one of the things that we also need to do is we also need to have our headquarters, whether it be the City Emergency Operations Center, whether it be the fire department or the police station, they have to have quarters that are safe. So in this case here, Terrace Search and Rescue has embarked on building a new search and rescue hall. It's going to be located down on Gregg. It is going to be built post-disaster for the purpose of earthquakes and hopefully withstand earthquakes. It will be probably the only emergency services building that will have any earthquake proof to it. So we're building it for the future. Good and bad, you know, the search and rescue members are taking it on their shoulders to raise money for it. So it's an extra $85,000, $95,000 to earthquake proof it. We feel that it's the right thing to do. In a disaster, this falls under the emergency management for the city. So the city will be moving their operations into this building if required. You know, if the fire department knocked down and we dealt with all the problem, good possibility fire department could move into here temporary until they had a new home. You know, that's the relationship that search and rescue has with the fire department and the city, but also as emergency planning. On the second floor of this is going to be, this is 6,000 square feet. The top floor is 3,600. In that top floor of the 3,600 squares, it's just under 2,000 square feet, is going to be the training room. Right now, we have a hard time finding locations in Terrace to do training, so that's the main goal. So we can have our meetings there. The second one is if we have to open up an EOC, where can we have an EOC big enough that actually can be housed? So that's the idea here. It'll have kitchen facilities, it'll have emergency generator facilities, it'll have everything, so a center could be opened and all emergency services could work out of here for the future. So when we start looking at disasters that start getting into directly involved with Terrace, yes, sorry.
Graham's in the floodplain.
Oh, sorry, not Graham, Craig.
Oh.
Did I say? That's maybe what your hand was. Sorry, Greg, right across the street from Terrace Standard, janitor's warehouse. Yes.
The one concern that I really have is because it's likely that we would have a rail emergency if there was an explosion. And
Yes.
It seems like the police, the fire, this place, they're all So
We are all susceptible to injury, yes.
So I'm just wondering why they're not looking like further away from the railroad.
We do everything we can to try that. I think
For all emergency services, it's not clicking. For all emergency services, you kind of flip a coin and you say who's going to get wiped out, who's not. It's kind of unfortunate. So the fire hall, yes, we need a new fire hall. Where would we build that? We need land. Search and rescue, you know, as much as, you know, we needed land, we found a lot that was accessible to us. We realize and we acknowledge it's by the tracks. When you start doing your disaster planning, one of the worst case scenario is a kilometer and a half as far as safe distances. So we start looking at the different distances from the fire department and the search and rescue hall. If one gets, you know, blown up, hopefully the other won't. Our provisions are we would go to the college, we would go to the arena. We have other sites. But it's a valid point and it's a valid concern that we deal with all the time, you know. Yes. Yes, so part of our emergency disaster planning, very different situation. You know, when oil starts coming through here on our rail cars, they're controlled by speed and only so many cars in so many locations. The issue with Lac Mégantic is it was up on a hill, so by the time that train dislodged, it started coming down. So it had full speed, it turned a corner, and of course it wiped out their train. We don't believe that, you know, again, working with the different professionals, that type of situation could happen here. Have we had lots of rails? We have rail derailments all the time, low speed. So that's how it's managed. CN aren't allowed to store dangerous goods in the community. So when the three trains start going through here a day of 80 cars of propane, they're not allowed to stop in downtown Terrace. So a rail car, for example, 1.6 kilometers. That's how far in the event of a disaster. So that's part of our planning, for sure. Great point. Unfortunately, yes, we are in the wrong spot. So, yes.
I understand there are speed limits for the train.
Yes.
And sometimes it doesn't seem like they're being adhered to.
No, and it totally depends on what is actually the product on the track. Right, so that's how they start, you know, whether it's a dry commodity, whether it's a diesel commodity.
So there's different risks. All hazardous material, there is a controlled speed. Now, again, all the safety that it's never going to happen, but unfortunately with disasters and incidents, everybody learns. And, you know, I know for the CN locomotives, there's just so many now that train should never, the Lac Mégantic should never happen with that engine. I think the location won't because, you know, we're not on a hill. So other issues, other concerns to us, but again, we try to do the best we can. When we start looking at those disasters, so in this case here, this was a fire this was, I think, 4 years ago when forestry came to us. So this is Terrace Mountain. Fire starts here. We have to evacuate all of Birch, the trailer park, all of Westview, and all the Kitsless people. Any hazard to guess on how many homes are inside of those circles? $547. I know, I was shocked. I had to count them again. It's just crazy. Like just the bench itself, you know, behind the arena, you know, park, you know, down in here, the trailer park, Westview, all these homes, right? So from emergency management perspective, how do I get everybody in that circle there evacuated? So we talked about kind of like our alarm systems here. I have to have notice. So we'll send out an alert. It's fire coming, so we'll send out an order. We tell everybody that they need to move. We want everybody to go down Park Hill. Nobody use the second hill, vice versa. We give everybody that option. Go here, do this, report to this spot. Because what happens when we evacuate half of these people and some go to Thornhill and some go to the college? We can't keep track. So we try to keep track and we tell everybody, go register here, and then at that point in time they can go to other family members. In this case here in Terrace is door to door, driving around with the sirens. So we don't have large air horns or fog horns like the old days. So it's just strictly door to door and knocking the radio. So that goes back to one of my earlier comments. If we have a disaster in our area, be tuned to it. You know, if a fire started, like say, perfect example at Twin River, if that fire got going, the first place we would have been sending people was up top. You know, the police and search and rescue. Anybody who had 2 legs, go up onto that bench and start knocking on these doors.
What if there were a large emergency, for example, the explosion, the concern about the explosion on the railway? Is there some, other than social media?
There's no, we have no sirens or no means for that. Social media is part of our emergency plan. So is the radio systems, but nothing as far as a horn or a larger siren.
And the concern for me, I have elderly parents who don't use the social media. How are they going to know that they shouldn't?
It's only, at this point in time, it's only going to be door knocking. And hopefully, and this is where I'll put my good community member hat on, good neighbors. Right? You know, can you help your neighbor? Can you go knocking door to door? Yes.
Why can't we get an alarm? When World War II ended, every town had before it ended, had an alarm. You heard the sirens, you knew something was happening.
Yes.
So then they could tune on their TVs or put their phones on or whatever, but I thought Terrace had that.
I think we had one on at the fire hall. That was the 1010 test, so that's how they used to call the volunteers in. You know, I'll throw that out there, and I'll ask, you know, what type of system is there that communities have gone away from that. Because if you have it, then you have to test it. And, you know, Smithers just went through that. They don't want it going off at lunchtime anymore. You know, it bothers, I know. I know. So yeah, so it's definitely a conversation that we should.
Help one for tsunami.
They do, yes. So so that's an early warning system for the tsunami. Yeah. And a tsunami is great. Yes, people are going to perish during a tsunami, but no different than a rail system in a large fire or a chlorine leak, you know, or a propane fire, right? So, okay. So here's part of our pre-planning. This is how we kind of look at it. How are we going to mitigate this? We need to move all these people. We send them to a location where they start to get processed. And then, hey, I have friends, I'm going to move, I'm going to go and stay with my friends. Perfect, you're out safe. So when we start looking at different evacuation orders and alerts, we have a fire over here, it's starting to burn. This is going to be an order. So no choice, no hugging, you're leaving. Beside that, depending on the type of emergency that it is, people will be on alert. So all summer long, you started to hear this community is on alert, this community is on an order, right? And the idea is nobody can go in and out of a order area. People can still move around on alert, and you're on free will. If you're on an alert, your luggage needs to be packed, your belongings need to be loaded up, everything needs to be, you know, processed and ready to go. You have time. To say you didn't have time is not the case on a larger incident. An incident that happens right now, yes, we know that happens. And you know, we had a fire down on Bronze Island. A homeowner that was 150, 200 feet from the house. You know, the daughter came in, woke them up. You know, the girlfriend, wife said, "Oh, what should be great?" And he snapped at her. He said, "Nothing. Run for your life. You know, get in the car." And they were in the truck driving down the driveway, because when he looked out the window, all as he saw was a 150-foot wall of fire coming at them, right? So unfortunately, that does happen too. So, and we can't prepare for that. You know, your home could be prepared. You know, where do you put your belongings? Some people, you know, like banks and keep their stuff in a safety deposit box. Some is at your home. You know, if you're worried about a potential fire, it should be treated. It should be somewhere else. It should be in a fire safe. Just lots of different things. So there's the order. So I wanted to touch on that. That's part of our emergency planning. Because we don't write orders and alerts all the time, we go to our web pages. Part of our emergency planning, in our emergency operations center, we have kits. Inside of that kits, this is how you do an alert. So working with our management team in the city, we have designated people that would fill this out. So we work with our staff. They'll fill this alert out. It'll get signed. It'll be processed. We work with the government on that. We issue an alert. We're making you aware. When we go to an order, same thing. What we want to do is we want to make sure we cover. You must leave the area immediately. Follow the travel route provided. If you need transportation. So we try to cover off all these. There's certain things that we can do or we could ask you to do. That's part of the order. That's going to go out on social media. That's going to go out on the radios. That's going to be handed out at door to door, right? In the event of something happening. So I just wanted to throw that in here. Sometimes we know the fire is coming. Sometimes we can prepare for it. In other cases, you know, we just don't. So this was the scene. This was down in Kelowna, but this was down, you know, exactly just like this. People were going through a horrific experience down at Francois Lake, you know, east, you know, in around Vanderhoof Burns Lake. You know, other side of the lake was burning up, and you know, there was just lots of chaos there. You know, you're told to evacuate, and you have to drive through this, right? Fort McMurray, Great Slave Lake, you know, Telegraph Creek. There was places where people were going. That's a lot of fuel. That's a lot of fire. So, you know, and you can only do so much. The most important thing is we get people, we get all the people that, you know, out as best we can, because we don't want anybody to perish. And at some point in time, you know, the fire is deep-seated. You just have to keep going. So, you know, when we start talking a disaster, people who help fight these fires, they go home. Now when the community opens up and the community goes back, you know, imagine this person going back to his business. So his livelihood. You know, I don't know exactly how the federal law goes, but when cars are parked on your lot, they're not insured. You know, how would this business owner afford that loss? Right? So that disaster to him could be his livelihood, for his family, could be everything. We start looking at, so we've covered some floods, we've covered some fires, earthquake. So it's not a matter of when we're, you know, if we're going to have an earthquake, it's a matter of when we're going to have an earthquake, especially the big earthquake. I was at home when we had our last one, and it was kind of weird, and I'm like, what the hell are the kids doing? You know, because the shades were going back and forth, and it was like inside the windowsill, tick, 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 and I'm like, who's moving the couch? And then I yelled to the kids, hey kids, come here, this is cool, have a look. And I don't know what I was thinking. Yeah, yes.
It's right on the line for tsunami. Kitimat would affect Terrace and the highways.
Yeah, so our pre-plan for the tsunami, so the tsunami, so Terrace is never going to be affected by a tsunami, by direct water, because of our elevation and we're inland so much, but we're going to be affected drastically because what we're going to do as part of our emergency plan is we're going to step up to receive Kitimat. So they can only go to so much high land, so we have a plan that will receive those individuals. Working with a lot of the big industrial camps, we have, I love saying this, we have $100 billion coming to our area. And when we meet with all of these different companies, they know there's issues with snow. They know that there's issues with tsunamis and disasters, and they all pledge any disaster we're going to help you. So if we need to house 300 people, they're going to get rid of their workers and they're going to house 300 people for us. Because in a disaster, it's more important for them to help the community than to keep working. So that's working and managing with it. So the tsunami's not coming our way. Is it going to happen in Kitimat? That's an argument I could lose. But, you know, they have a system in place for that, the same as Prince Rupert. So, but we have to prepare, how are we going to receive those people from either of those two towns or even Greenville and Kincolith? How are we going to help and receive them and process those people? Okay, hold that question because I know where you're going with that. So earthquakes, it's going to happen. We have to prepare for it. This goes back to what can you do? 72-hour kit, prepare your family, prepare your home, you know, learn and understand what happens in a disaster. How can you help yourself? How can you help your neighbor? To me, that's the most important thing. How can you help your neighbor? You know, because emergency services, we're not going to be able to be everywhere. So you can't prepare for an earthquake. It just happens, you know, and we're right on the line. So, you know, it happens all the time. You know, we have them on the coast. We have them up on Alaska. You know, I think we had 2 or 3 in Alaska this morning. So they're pretty steady. You know, when the one comes that's going to affect us, you know, we just don't know that. group lodging. So I'll quickly kind of wrap up in the event of what happens in a disaster. You have to go and stay where you're directed. If you have family members, if you have a travel trailer, awesome. When you register, you say, hey, I've been evacuated, this is where I live. I have friends in Smithers, I'm going to Smithers. Awesome, have a safe drive. And we sign you off, we know that you're safe. For others, on an apartment fire, the people that are at that hotel, when it burns down, where is the fire department going to house those 95 people? Right? So we're going to move everybody to group lodging, and this is what group lodging looks like. So in a disaster, it is what it is. We're going to do everything we can to feed you. We're going to do everything we can to hug you. We're going to do everything we can to keep a roof over your head and protect you from the environment. And we're going to do everything we can to try to get you back to your home or to friends as safe as possible. But some of us, some of you may be staying in group lodging for days or weeks, you know, ultimately months. You know, that shouldn't happen. You know, you look at Kamloops, everybody got bused to Prince George. You look at Prince George, everybody got bused to Kamloops or Edmonton, right? So that's part of our emergency plan. So it's something that we prepare for in our community. I believe we have 300 to 500. Salvation Army is good. Brian does a lot of work with the group, part of our pre-planning. So we have cots throughout the city stored in different locations. So we know at a group lodging we're going to go to an arena and you could put X amount of people in the arena. You could see in here there's no privacy. You know, what we have to watch is it's a disaster. We're going to do the best we can to feed you, but everybody has to work together. You know, when we look at the hurricanes coming in through the States, a lot of people were moved down, you know, and I think it was Katrina, they went to one of the big, huge superdomes or stuff like that, and there was just mutiny and riots going on. It's like, feed me, where's my water? I'm hungry. You know, and then unfortunately, humans revert back to being animals, and then it's just chaos. So in this case here, you know, they do the best they can. They train all the time. How do we manage people? How do we manage resources? How do we manage the incident? And like we saw earlier in the Emergency Act, how do we help you recover individually, as a community, as a neighborhood? So, and you know, earthquake, it would be the province. So we know that the call is going to go out for everybody in Canada to come help us. Vancouver's probably going to be knocked off. We're going to send resources down there. So for Terrace, part of our emergency planning, how soon do you think that we're going to have emergency services arrive to Terrace to help us? Yeah, I don't think they're coming. So, yeah, so our emergency planning is to try to help mitigate that. Our planning is how are we going to be resilient? How are we going to help our neighbors, help our community? You know, no different than in the floods in '79. I could say this. Most of you remember that. Sorry, Jen. But, you know, the floods, we get more floods in the fall than we do in the spring, right? So we were cut off from the world for, I don't know, a week or two, whatever. It was only high water, right? But, you know, I don't think anybody perished in those floods. So we do what we normally do. We just help our neighbors and we carry on and we do what we can to make everybody happy. Safe. That's probably the better word. So awesome. I can't believe it's exactly 1 o'clock. That wasn't planned. Any questions?
We do have the room, so if people have questions for Dave, let's have some Q&A.
We did have a couple during, you know, as we went, so.
Just, you mentioned ESS a couple of times. I'm a rookie with ESS, or I'm so impressed with that group and the training. So I'm just wondering if you could tell people how they might join.
Yeah, so I always call it emergency social service, emergency support services. Awesome group. It's now part of, I want to say law, part of the Emergency Act. We have to have ESS. It's a group that you could volunteer. You know, I know that they're online. I know that they're listed under the City of Terrace. You can always phone the fire department. We'll put you in touch with one of the girls. Michelle is our emergency coordinator for Terrace and Skeena. And they have meetings regularly. You know, they have training, they do a phenomenal group. We've seen them, I can say firsthand, you know, we had a house fire, you know, people would show up, where's the homeowner? And the homeowner's on the lawn chair in the neighbor's yard, covered in a coat. What's the fireman doing? Well, the fireman trying to stop the house from burning down, right? You know, we didn't have time to hug that person, right? So we're learning now through our ESS partners, how do we help that person sooner? So as soon as we have a house fire, as soon as we start to, you know, have an issue with a homeowner and where can they go, we get on the phone right away and we say, hey, dispatch ESS. They have a team, they come out, and then they process that individual. So at the end of that night, that person's in a hotel room, safe, fed. There's a plan in place for clothes for X amount of days and food for X amount of days. So that's the group. So the best would be, you know, I know you can't go wrong if you phone the fire department and they'll get the contact information.
Or show up to a meeting.
And they'll tell you when that is to find that meeting, because I know I'm supposed to be kind of part of that at this level. I don't know where their meetings are.
No, it's an awesome group
So,
and
it is.
Great training.
And we've seen with the wildfires, they're more active than anything else, because perfect example, Terrace was not affected by fire. But were we affected heavily because of the evacuees? Yes. So all the evacuees that came to Terrace for our fires regionally, they got processed by our ESS staff, who are volunteers, right? And they work day in, day out processing people. They have to go back every 3 days to make sure that they got, you know, what they needed for help. So an awesome group.
Who picks up the bill for hotels and things like that?
So that comes under the government. So back earlier where I talked about a task, Emergency Management BC, they'll get a task number, they'll fall under that, you know. But again, at some point in time that task has to end. If the disaster is over, and unfortunately, so at a house fire, that task is 3 days. They'll get a hotel paid for 3 days, food for 3 days, and after that they're on the curb. Right? So then that's where other groups such as Salvation Army, Red Cross, Good Samaritans, they kick in and they help different church groups. Yeah, so good question.
Wait, I'm gonna stats right now. What's your chimney fires?
So we've only had half a dozen, so not very many.
Per year?
Per year, I would say 8 to a dozen.
Okay, so my question is, I'm hearing the reaction, and money's coming in for this and new. What about proactive and responsibility? I know you say clean your eaves and do this and this, but I'm in Thornhill, and I know I'm in Terrace,
Yeah.
but we're getting a septic bylaw officer. So why can't we have a chimney bylaw officer? Somebody comes around to make it safe for you. Now this has
Yes.
two sides to it. Because
Yeah.
A, he comes by and your chimney's safe, I can get fire insurance because it's been inspected. So it comes back to the people, I can get my house
Yes.
insured because this gentleman who municipal bylaw officer's appointed, knowledgeable, comes around and says, yes, here you go, your chimney's safe. Or to the guy down the road, I'm sorry, you're a hazard, but he's also a hazard to me, he lives
Yes.
beside me. So can we make some bylaws or regulations?
You can. So bylaws would be the place to do that. So right now in the city of Terrace, you know, it's not a requirement to clean your chimney. Right?
It's not a good idea
It's not a good idea not to. So if it's on fire, we'll respond, but yes, we would like to not respond.
That's right.
You know, so the onus goes back to the homeowner and the homeowner being responsible to do that. And lots don't. Or they buy a log and they throw it in there and yeah, it's clean. And we go there, yeah, I cleaned it 6 months ago, and we're like, yeah, you're full of crap. Because I can't even see in it.
Someone's
So
gonna get a $500 fine though, because I know I'm in the wrong.
That would-
Now would say, okay, this is an incentive for everybody.
that would be bylaws. And
Yeah.
right now we don't, the city doesn't have provisions for that. So, okay.
Dave, do you know how many evacuees we had for Telegraph?
Whew. You know what, I don't. I saw numbers, you know, 35, 100, 200, you know, it was kind of revolving at different times. I know we were full capacity for a few weeks,
Yeah.
you know, 1 week for sure in Terrace. That number, I can't
Now, when
say
you said that the hotels were full, I was wondering if there's any role for just keeping a roster of available billets where people would open up a spare bedroom for evacuees.
I'll mention that to them. I know that most people are very resilient. Hey, I know somebody, you know, so we want them to be housed and to feel safe. You know, I think that would happen afterwards when either the aid is running out or the task is closing. But as far as provisions for that goes, you know, I'm not sure. I know word gets out in disasters pretty quickly, and communities come together to look after their citizens. Yeah.
What happens to pets?
So again, in the past, we won't talk about it. Currently and in the future, our ESS group does awesome. So there's provisions for that. During the evacuation or the pre-planning with the alert, they'll do everything they can to try to help mitigate those pets. So for example, a person can't take their dog into this center, right, or cats into this center. So those are identified and they're moved to different spots. Phenomenal programs. Again, like they do, it's not just about the humans anymore, it's very much about the, and if that object, I guess a pet's not an object, if that animal, you know, that pet was attached, you know, so yes, I do love cats, and my mom's a little bit crazy with cats. She loves cats, you know, she wouldn't go anywhere if she couldn't take her cat. So is there a place that we could put the two of them, right? Is there a billet, for example, that would take pets and the occupant or the owner, right? So I know that they have a great program now, even to the point of, you know, with our farming, you know, we received a shitload of horses and cattle from Burns Lake in Houston, right? So cattle's a big deal. You know, the cow's no longer a cow, it walks in the field. That's $3,500 or $4,000 that's standing there. So if you kill all that farmer's cattle, that's devastating. So ENBC is getting very good. Communities are getting, I know we house a whole bunch of horses here in our community. Different people did, and cattle, so it's awesome. It's awesome. Jen?
Just thinking back to the snowstorm that we had a couple of Februaries ago, I thought it was like a borderline state of emergency, like only emergency services should have been out instead of people. What classifies as a state of emergency?
Good question. I think it starts to come when infrastructure is burdened. So so for the city of Terrace, their snow clearing policy is the main routes first. So regardless of how much snow, they're always open up the main arteries, right? So, you know, it's going to be all the main roads, all the highways, the bridges, the hills. So if those were inundated and nothing would happen, that would start to get to it. If power started to be affected, you know, people not going to school, people not going to work, you know, it's just considered a snow day. But I think it starts to come into, you know, how are the citizens affected and how long is that going? In the old days, they just grabbed the cats and the loaders and they cleaned the streets themselves, and they always looked after their neighbors, right? It just was snow. 3 feet of snow wasn't a big deal. You know, 3 feet of snow in half the other cities or lower mainland, it shuts them down for a long time. Here it's just awesome, we get a snow day, we'll just take a couple days to clear the driveway, right? So that's a good question. I think it just depends on the disaster or the length of the disaster as well.
If the disaster included environmental impacts, where would they be deployed from to deal with the environmental issues?
So good question. That's all the resources here that we have. So part of getting that task number through ENBC, it also opens up the doors for resources. So the perfect example is the RCMP detachment. So when RCMP detachment has a larger incident, the 2 or 3 people that work shift work that are on nights tonight, they can't handle that. They pick the phone up, a unit from Prince George can come in. Another highway patrol unit can come in. So whether it's a crime or whether it's ident. So that's using their resources regionally. So that's how BC that's how Terrace would be as well. We don't have a lot of hazmat capabilities here in town or to deal with environment. So of course that call would go to ENBC, hey, we need this type of services. So we know part of pre-planning, Kitimat would come in, Prince Rupert would come in, the agencies, the companies, they would be flying people in and driving people. So again, it would expand to the size of the disaster and then it would decrease after the disaster. So good question. I think there's a question up front.
Can't remember anymore.
Okay.
Dave, what I was gonna say, go back to the animals.
Yes.
We're in partnership with the animal control people here.
Yes.
And they make room at their place, plus the fairgrounds is open to horses, cattle, and cages for all your other animals. So we do have it, it's just who the partnership is.
And it's, again, awesome. We're seeing the community and groups come forward, and, you know, they're really solving those problems. And for the emergency management and EMBC people, it's a breath of fresh air, because all we need to do is phone and say, hey, can you help mitigate this? You know, and you know, for the fire chief or for the CEO of city not having to worry about where 100 people go because our ESS group is looking after it, that's just it makes our job so much easier, so we could focus on different things. So great point.
Thanks, Dave. Please join me
Awesome.
in thanking Dave for an interesting presentation and a great discussion. And here's a beer mug for you to help celebrate when the fire's out.
I know where I could use that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.